Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do most Sundays. You can ask gardening questions down below at the bottom of this video, and I pick from those each week. I think I've picked maybe 20 or 22 this week. I'm at Tom and Ram Gibsons' beautiful garden in Athens, Georgia. Steph and I have been traveling this week. We've been to several cities and several gardens, and we stopped in to see Tom and Ram's beautiful garden here in Athens, which I've shown on the channel a few times. There's a playlist on the channel actually called the Gibson Garden, if you want to go and take a look at that. You can see, I mean, this is just an absolutely amazing place. All the videos I think I've ever done here have just tons and tons of views, and there's a reason why. As you can hear all the water around me, there's nowhere you can go in this garden that you won't hear water. Just an amazing place. I think we put up 2 videos on the Garden Plants with Jim Putnam channel this week. It was Rosalinda Indian Hawthorn and Miss Kim Lilac went up this week. If you're not subscribed over there on that channel, go and check that one out. It's Garden Plants with Jim Putnam as opposed to HortTube with Jim Putnam, which is this channel. The Learn to Garden series, I put up a planting video right about the time the Q&A went up last week, and we've been out of town this week, but during the week this week I'm going to do a video on pollinator plants for the Learn to Garden channel. So if you're subscribed to that, thank you very much. There's a $50 off discount code right below this video if you're interested in joining up with that. And also, a lot of you have bought the t-shirts that I made a few weeks ago, so thank you very much for that. If you can't find the link below the video for the t-shirts, it's over on my website, HortTube.com. Enough of all that, let's get to some questions. Let's see. Somebody asked about pressure washing their house and the potential damage to the plants. So yeah, the bleach can cause some damage to the plants. One technique that I know people use is, if you're going to use bleach to power wash, is they'll water the plants down a bit and hoping that dilutes the bleach a bit. Some plants are going to be more sensitive to it than others. What I did on the old house was I just didn't use bleach. I had vinyl siding on my old house, and my power washer was good enough to get 90% of it off, and I just didn't worry about it. And that way I didn't have to think about it one way or the other. You don't necessarily have to use chemicals if you're using a pretty good power washer. You may have to power wash a little more often, but I just try to use as few chemicals just on everything as I possibly can. That's just me. Somebody said, do I worry about termites in wood chips? I don't worry about it at all. We had a pile on the driveway for a long time last year because I got on the Chip Drop website. I figured we'd get about 20 yards when it was delivered, and it was probably 26, 28, maybe 30 yards came. And our tiny lot there in Raleigh, we couldn't use them all up at once, so we've used them for all kinds of stuff, and we still have a few. While they were on the driveway toward the end, there was a couple times where there was some termite activity on the driveway, but that was when they were piled up this high. It wasn't when they were piled up, 4 or 5, 6 inches. It was when the pile was bigger. Just a few weeks ago in the neighborhood, all the termites flew. There's a season there at the end of winter, early spring, when you'll see the termites actually flying. And it's just a normal thing. If you have wood, you're going to have termites. But if you piled the hardwood mulch up long enough, you'd probably get them unless it got too hot. So, I mean, it's not something I worry about at all. And once I spread them out, I don't have an issue at all. But in the big pile one time last year, I did see a few. As soon as they were spread out, they were dead. Okay. So somebody has stunted seedlings in their seed trays. So they've started, I think it was mostly perennial things, and they just haven't grown. So they germinated. You can hear all the frogs, the water, and everything in here. So this whole garden is like this. And then we're around a couple highways here, and I can hear off in the distance, I can hear some cars and things, but all of this noise, it's incredible how much it drowns it all out. So, sometimes your seedlings come up, and once I get true leaves on our seedlings, that's when we start to fertilize them. So I don't know if you fertilized them yet, but we do use a liquid organic fertilizer on our seedlings. Once they get to it, there's just not enough. Whatever seed starting media you're using doesn't really have a lot of it doesn't have any fertilizer in it, and it's not rock dust. It doesn't have what the plants need at a certain point. The seed has all the plant needs to get up and get going, and then it's got to start relying on the ground, the rock, you know, the sand or the clay or whatever it's supposed to be growing in, to start growing it. So until you put it in the ground, you got to supplement it some. So we probably every other watering add a small amount of organic liquid fertilizer to the water, and that's how we do that. So somebody has some creeping Jenny. They have a formal garden and they're trying to fill in between the plants with a ground cover. They were hoping for a gold ground cover, but the creeping Jenny hasn't grown as fast as they wanted it to. Is there something else? Certainly you can use a gold, you can try a gold sedum in its place. I think that is quite possible. I mean, the best I ever see the creeping Jenny grow, it's got a little bit of moisture to work with, so I don't know if your beds are really dry or if the things that are in the beds are out competing it in some way. But you can, you know, try to irrigate it a little more if you want to try, you know, keep the creeping Jenny. You can also, they ask if they should just buy some more and plug it in. You can actually root from your own group. You know, it roots really, really easily. So you can probably divide what you have if you want to. But you can also, again, try a gold sedum and see if that grows any faster in that space. It might be more tolerant of whatever the problem is. You know, again, I probably think it's, you know, again, most of the time when I see creeping Jenny really take off, it's slightly moist. Not wet, but slightly moist area. Okay. Oh, and then part of that question was, is it good for good for shading the roots? And yeah, I talk about that a lot, about shading the roots on your plants. If you look at this garden or any video from this garden, everything is shading its neighbor. This garden is there's no plant here that's not touching another plant, and they're all thriving because of it, because their roots are shaded. Their tops are racing up here for sunlight, but their roots are down hidden and shaded from the direct sun. Okay, so somebody asked about weeding in established plants, and this can kind of be tricky if you have delicate plants. And so if you have, she had specifically irises, and so if you have things like irises and they're coming up in the spring, it is harder to weed around them. I try to do most of the weeding. The majority of the weeding we do is in the wintertime in the garden. That's when we can really get into plants and look at them and see. You know, we have ligustrum that come up, and we have ivy that tries to come up from underneath things, because all these invasive plants are seeding themselves, you know, throughout our neighborhood. So we try to go in there and get them out during the winter time. So the best time is before those irises and perennials and all those things start to come up. Once they're up, it is more, you know, it's pretty easy to damage some of those things. And so I might just try to use a trowel and get under them just a bit and see if you can pop some of them out if they're difficult to pull things. Although up until about mid-April, about the time you're watching this, the soil is pretty wet in my area, and I can still pull things up pretty easily without damaging the things around them. As it gets drier during the summer, it's hard. Most things just start breaking off and don't pull out very easily. So the sooner the better. And in the winter time is when we really scout for all of those invasive weeds that are in our beds and trying to come up in our middle of our shrubs, and they were kind of hidden all year long. Okay, let's see. So somebody talked about tree forming a limelight hydrangea. They wanted to know when to prune off the lower branches. I've talked about this a bunch of times. If you're limbing something up, the argument is, or you know, bonsai folks say to leave the limbs on, and that will create more growth. It creates more energy for the plant. For me, I would rather just take them off and get it over with and get the thing in the shape that I want it, because the bigger those limbs get, the more wound it's going to be when you cut them off later. So the sooner the better. I'd get them cut off. I'd get the thing staked like you want it to. I've got a video on the channel, tree forming a hydrangea paniculata. You can go back and look at that video. You're going to see another upcoming video on that plant, an update on it, and the pruning that I need to do in the next few weeks on that plant. So you'll see that video pretty soon, but they're actually easy, and you're in full control of a hydrangea paniculata. You're in full control, and you'll see that in the video. I'm in absolute full control of where the branches are going to come from, how they're going to look in the future, every bit of it. Okay, somebody has a saucy wine salvia, wanted to know if they should prune or should trim it and not let it bloom early in the season, because I was pruning off my salvia, or we put in an annual planting video in the back garden a week or so ago, and I pruned off all the new seedlings, or all the new plants that we put in the ground, to prevent them from blooming initially while they get rooted into the ground. And they were just asking if they should do the same thing on this saucy wine salvia. You'd only need to do this if it wasn't already branched. So part of the thing is, my seedling comes up and it's just a single branch with one little flower on the top. So I take the flower off the top and I get it to branch into 3. I can take those flowers off and I can get those to branch into like 6 or 8 or 9 flower spikes. And so that's the purpose of that. If your saucy wine salvia is already pretty bunchy, already pretty full, let it bloom and enjoy it. If it's thin, cut it. So that's the real reason I'm doing that, to get it to fill out and not just keep growing straight up like that. So somebody asked about fixing. They've got very poor drainage in their clay soils, and they think it was just kind of over-prepped. I talked about this in last week's Q&A video, that sometimes you can over-prep clay soils and then end up with boggy conditions. They wanted to know how to fix it. I think if you have a spot in your clay soils that's boggy, you can either, put in some sort of French drain, pull the mulch away, regrade it in some way to make sure water is running off of it. If it is an area that's just always been wet, I get the question a lot of times, what plants can I use to dry out an area? That doesn't actually work. The plants aren't going to dry the area up, but you can get plants that are tolerant of those conditions. So a lot of our native plants actually grow in those types of conditions. When Steph and I hike a lot, and when we see Itea, and when we see Clethra, and when we see, a lot of our native flowering shrubs, we actually see them along streams and along the banks of ponds and creeks, rivers, that kind of thing. So a lot of our native plants are great for those kind of moist conditions like that. Again, they're not going to cure the problem though. If it's problematic for you and you actually want to get it dry, you're going to have to mechanically do it in some way. You're going to have to pull the mulch back, regrade it, or trench through it and put some sort of underground French type drain in underneath it. So let's go. Let's move to another spot. Moving to another spot, and you can probably hear the water behind me again, and I think you can see Steph sitting back here in a chair. Usually it's Holly wandering around in the garden at home behind us. Holly is with us on this trip, but she's not here at the Gibson Garden right now. Let's see. The next question, and Ram just came out and said, say hello to everyone. So if you've seen any of the videos from this garden, Ram is definitely a star, and she said to tell everyone hi. So there you go. Let's see. Someone is in zone 6 and they bought zone 6 Encore azaleas, and they're up by, they said Lake Erie, and they feel like they've babied them, but they're still only getting a couple flowers here or there. I am, They also ask if they could spray wilt proof on them, which is a way to keep the wind from actually desiccating them. The wind can blow across the tops of plants in the wintertime so much that it takes water out of the top of the plant faster than roots can bring it up, or the ground could be frozen and it can't bring any water up. So that's why people use wilt proof. So that's a possibility, but I think overall, one of the issues, here's one of the problems with the horticultural zone map, is that it's only measuring your average low temperature. And so this person says they're in 6B, but they're that far north of where I'm at in Raleigh, North Carolina. And when I see, so I'm in zone 7B. If you look at the horticultural zone map, part of Long Island is in zone 7. I think is even a part of it 7B. But when I do consultations with someone on Long Island, in the dead of winter, I don't see many leafy evergreen plants. And one of the differences is, again, all the horticultural zone map is measuring is that their average low temperature and my average low temperature are the same, but they're not talking about how many hours you're receiving that average low temperature or your low temperatures that you're getting each winter. And so your day is potentially an hour shorter than mine in the peak of winter. So, and that has a giant impact on how many more hours you're potentially staying below freezing. So not just your, the low temperature you're getting down to, but the amount of hours that the plant is experiencing below freezing is going to be substantially more than mine in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so there is an impact there. And so when they say something is, when you're saying something is zone 6 hardy, zone 6, 7 hardy, zone 8 hardy, the map isn't taking into account the fact that you might be 300, 400, 500 miles north of someone else in the same zone, and the amount of daylight that's actually going to cost you. So my suspicion is that's part of your issue as well, is that yours are experiencing way more hours of freezing than they would in zone 6B in places further south that are zone 6B, like the North Carolina mountains or something like that. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked about when to move gladiolas. So this is an interesting question because they're in zone 6B and they've managed to get gladiolas to live and come back every year. And they're probably outside the area. They may have just a little pocket where it's just warmer in that spot during the winter time. And so they're coming back every year, wanting to know when they should move them because they're in a little bit too much shade. Normally you move gladiolas in the late summer, early fall after they've finished blooming and they're starting to go dormant. It's a good time to move them or divide them. But in this particular case, I think you'd want to do it in the spring, and I think you'd only want to do it with a few of them initially because you may be moving them to a place they're not going to come back. They're not going to be winter hardy. So I'm a little leery about telling anyone the best time to move gladiolas in a place where gladiolas probably shouldn't be growing in the first place, but they're not blooming as well because they're in too much shade. Maybe you can try. I don't know if you've looked up and see if maybe you can lift the shade. I'm in a really bright spot right now, but another thing about this garden is I'm getting a lot of sun on me right this minute, but overall this is a pretty shady garden. The trees have been limbed up over the years, and this is very high shade, so it's still bright enough down here to have all of these what you would call full sun flowering perennials in kind of a dappled light space, but it's very, very bright. So I don't know if there's an opportunity to thin the tree that's above it. Just throwing that out there. Somebody has wild violets growing in their beds and out in their lawn. They actually kind of look okay. They look kind of nice in the beds. Can they garden with them or live with them? Probably not. I don't like, wild violets can, the plants and the flowers can be attractive, but I don't like plants that can both spread and seed. Those are going to be really, really hard to combat, and your seed bank is going to be ever increasing. So that thing's going to produce seed every year, and even if they don't come up, it's going to put seed down that's going to be coming up for a long, long time. So that's a plant that I'm going to get rid of. I just don't like anything that decides to seed itself on its own, and just puts itself in new places all the time without my permission. So that's one that I would consider a weed in your beds, and then somebody's going to tell me they can eat it or something. I don't know what they're going to. I don't know if you can or can't, but that's usually what I get when I talk about pulling anything deemed a weed out. It's like you can put that in chicken. It's the best thing ever, or you can it's good for glaucoma or whatever it is. I don't know. Wild violets are to me weeds, and to someone else I'm sure I'm going to hear at the bottom of the video the 90 things you can do with wild violets. Okay, so let's see. Somebody asked about in-planting around. They've got small perennials. They've spaced them the appropriate spacing, whatever was on the tag or whatever, and they've got space in between them. Should they in-plant between them? Yes, absolutely. That's our strategy in the garden at the house. That's the strategy Ram uses here, and this place is just chock-a-block full with, every square inch has something growing in it. And so I like to plant thick and edit later. So I would think about putting in some annuals in between those spaces for this summer. And when those perennials go to sleep at the end of this year and come back next year, they'll be fuller and bigger. And then you can choose to use a few less annuals until your border's filled in like you want it filled in. So somebody has a Ruby Falls redbud. That's the weeping redbud. I usually can point behind me, but I'm not at home, to my Golden Falls redbud. Theirs had 2 main branches up at the top that were coming down, and then those branches were spread out into more branches. One side has died completely during the winter time, so they only have the one growing on the other side. You know, how is that going to look? What you can do is on the branch that's alive down toward the bottom of where the hanging branches are, I would give that a bit of a haircut and hope that will force some sort of dormant bud up near the top of the plant to put out some additional growth. And so every time I've given I call it lifting the skirt on my golden falls. My golden falls gets all the way to the ground, starts spreading out across the ground. I prune it up about 2 feet, and when I do that, I get some additional growth along stems up higher up on the plant. So I think if you slow that side down occasionally, you can hopefully force some growth that will go in that other direction. You can't predict where the growth is going to come from. It may add more growth to that side to start with, to the already heavy side, but hopefully you can get something that will start to grow that other direction. Okay, so somebody asked, why do trees split? They have an apricot that's oozing down at the bottom, I guess. Why do trees split? There's actually a lot of reasons that trees can split, and it doesn't have to just be fruit trees. You'll get river birches frequently do it. Lots of trees are more susceptible than others to splitting. Sometimes you can get the sun hitting a tree early in the morning and it just warming up too quickly on that side of the tree, and that can cause splitting. Just like anything else, you warm up too fast, you can break glass by pouring boiling water on it potentially if it's cold. So you're warming it up too quick, and that causes the splitting. Another thing that can happen, and especially the way we had that December freeze, is that you can go too cold too quick, and so the plant, most of these trees, when they lose their leaves, they're storing all their everything that tree needs and everything that tree made from the leaves during that season. It stores all that under the ground in the roots through the winter time, and the top of the tree is much lighter at that time of the year. It's taking that water out and taking everything out, else out down to the roots. Sometimes a freeze can happen so quickly that the water is trapped in there and it expands and cracks it from the inside out. And then you can just get trees that grow too fast. That's a possibility as well. If you're pushing something too fast, that has a possibility. And of course there are insect, borers and things. They're not going to cause cracking, but they can cause, issues, boring into the side of the plant, and that can cause oozing as well. So few reasons for cracking and some other reasons for just the oozing, from disease or insects or that kind of thing as well. I usually just leave those things alone and let them heal themselves for the most part. Okay. So somebody asked about my favorite shade annuals and perennials. We're going to do a video on that when we get back to the house. That's one of the videos that's on our list for the next few weeks. So you're going to see that pretty soon, and it'll be annuals and perennials that we use in our shady spaces at the house. And we'll probably throw in some others that we don't have in the garden as well. So somebody asked, do perennials get smaller each year? What could be going on with that? So some perennials are possibly not getting enough cold treatment during the winter time. So some things need to go to sleep and stay asleep for a certain amount of time before they wake up. And so they can end up smaller each year. You'll see that in bulbs. You'll see that in tulip bulbs in my area. The first year I'll put them in the refrigerator and give them plenty of cold. They go in the ground. They come up and bloom like I'm in Holland. And then the next year they come up and they're about 2/3 the height, and the flower is about 2/3 the size. The third year, sometimes they don't come back, or they come back, it's just the foliage, and I don't even get a flower on them. So that can happen with hyacinths with us as well. They can get smaller each year. It just depends on the winters we're having. And then their perennial plants, same thing. They need a certain amount of chill hours to stay dormant. Otherwise, they come out and they didn't rest long enough. The other thing that can make them smaller is if it's a wet area, and so the plant goes to sleep in the winter, and then it's not able to use any of the water that it's sitting in. So sometimes a garden can be much wetter in the winter months than it was in the summer or the spring. And so you can identify that as a potential problem for, the roots are literally rotting on them. They're still got enough oomph to come back, but they're coming back at least initially smaller every spring and less vigorous. Of course, you could have something like voles that are chewing the roots on your plants, especially you know, during the winter time, you know, they're underground foragers that can, you know, that can eat the roots on the plants. And so there's probably a lot of reasons why, you know, plants could get smaller year to year. Again, I'm not in your situation, so I don't know, but I would think about some of those things. Is the area staying too wet? Are the perennials that I'm using, you know, meant for colder areas than the area that I'm in? You know, that kind of thing. You know, could be the case. Somebody asked about pruning grapes, or when to prune grapes, or is it too late to prune grapes? Typically, you would want to have done it by now. You know, I would think that most areas of the country, you'd be doing it late winter, very, very early spring, so that, you know, for people in the deep south, January, and, you know, for people in my area, February, early March, that kind of thing. But is it too, so I look at pruning like this. Number one, anytime I get a pruning question on fruit, I always say check with your local extension agent in your county, or a garden center, or some professional in your area about fruit plants in your area, because fruit plants will have different requirements in different places around the country, different timings on different things that you're going to do. So, you know, if you have fruit plant questions, they're best for your local county extension agent, wherever you are in the country, and what fruit plants grow best in your area, all those kinds of things. Any general information somebody's giving you about fruit plants is probably not great, you know, necessarily for the area that you live in. I've got blueberry videos on the channel. They're the most complicated videos I have on the channel, because I have to talk about the fact that you have to have different blueberries for everywhere you live, you know, in the country, depending on chill hours. I just talked about that dormancy period. You know, you need different blueberries for different areas. So check with people in your area about when to prune, you know, and when to, you know, how to thin the trees, what you can actually grow well in your area for fruit plants. And I think you'd get the better information than you would from me giving you some sort of general information. But I look at pruning like, what is the best time to prune it versus will it eat my house? You know, so it may not be the best time to prune it, but if it's going to just go absolutely bonkers this summer and eat something that it's on, you may need to prune it anyway. So, you know, whether it's the best time or not. Okay, so somebody has 3 snowball viburnums. They have the Chinese snowball, macrocephalum, and then they've got the Japanese snowball, and the funny, I'm looking back here behind me because Ram has all 3 as well, and then they have the Eastern snowball, or the Viburnum opulus. She has all 3 back here, and we were here last year and they were all 3 blooming at the same time, but they've bloomed out this year, unfortunately. I wanted to come back and take that photo again. It was all the smaller growing. The Eastern snowball is shrub size, or, you know, maybe head high, Viburnum opulus, and then the Japanese snowball can be kind of just a large shrub, and then the Chinese snowball can be a tree, which hers is back here. So they had all 3 of them, and they've only got 1 or 2 blooms on them. What is that, the Arctic blast from December? Yes, we only have 1 flower on our Chinese snowball. She has more in here, and she doesn't have really any damage in this garden. There's a couple things here or there, but almost nothing. This garden is so well established. The shading from the overhead canopy out here is protecting it from cold. I just don't think wind could have really cut through here and caused her any real damage. It's the advantage of having a really mature garden versus a new garden where everything was exposed to the cold, you know, the cold winds blowing across the top of it. So she didn't have that kind of damage, and hers bloomed well. I saw a couple photos of them that she had taken. But again, mine didn't, because it's in an open space. It just wasn't protected enough, and that cold got it. So somebody has an evergreen magnolia in a container, and it got some damage during the winter. Will it come back? So it's still bendable, pliable. It's got some new growth coming on it. Yes, but I will tell you, one winter I had terrible damage on my 7 and 15 gallon magnolias at my nursery. So pretty big container material. I mean, where it defoliated them, 80% of the leaves were gone, and they just looked bad. It was like 2 years before those things filled back in. It's not a fast thing. I wish I'd have just made the decision that day to dump them in the trash and moved on with my life. So that's what I'll tell you. Yes, it will come back, but it'll be a while. So you know, do with that information what you want to do with it. But it won't look good for a little while. So somebody's in the south and they were thinking about doing some sort of boxwood hedge. Is there something better than boxwoods? And I've talked about a few times. I actually think dwarf Yaupon hollies, Yaupon hollies are native to the southeast. The dwarf Yaupon holly is a selection at just a little low doming habit, easy to prune into boxes or formal shapes of any kind. So if you can find, you know, dwarf Yaupon, and sometimes with dwarf Yaupon hollies, you can find little gallon pots just like you can with boxwoods. So either one that you want to use. If you're concerned about ending up with a disease in something, you could use boxwoods for part of it and then Yaupon for another part of it. I don't know what kind of shapes you were making, but you could make one shape, you know, out of the dwarf Yaupons and then make another, you know, interior shape, you know, with boxwoods or something like that. So you could use both if, you know, because I do talk about not planting all the same thing, you know, just in case some disease or insect or something comes along, you don't lose all of it. Okay, so somebody asked about planting azaleas under pine trees, and they're not having a lot of luck. You know, the first year they look okay, and then the second year they're declining a bit. I've talked about this. Anytime you're planting under established trees, the trees are going to be out to kill your plants. Not really, but they're well established in that space. The roots are in that space. I actually, in some old established pines and oaks that I planted in and are in and around the city of Raleigh, I would actually mound up some pine bark soil conditioner and compost on top of the existing soil and plant about half down in the ground and about half up, and give the plants a little bit of time to get rooted into a media that's not in direct competition with the roots for the trees at that time. So that's the strategy I've used, is planting things up higher in using some organic material up on the top. And then also, you know, drip irrigation. It's probably the appropriate use for drip irrigation is in a wooded space where you're planting around established trees. You're gonna have to water longer. Some of this stuff out here where there's not tree roots, I could probably put something in the ground, water it once and walk away, and maybe not water it again. Depends on what it is here in the southeast, because we're getting normally pretty normal rainfall. But if I put it next to tree, you know, if I put it right up against a tree, you know, with established roots, and it's a dry, shady space, I may have to go like 2 years watering it before it's able to fight against that plant. So that's something I think about, is when I'm planting in the dry shaded spaces, even if it's things that are tolerant of dry shade, I know I'm going to have to monitor those plants longer into the future. Okay, last question for this week. Somebody asked if it's too late to prune or hard prune a Carolina Jasmine. So they have this Carolina Jasmine. It took years to grow up onto the top of a trellis, and it's finally got to the point where it was doing what they intended, which was shading the space. And about 80% of it has died back over some period of time because they haven't pruned it or maintained, you know, done any kind of pruning on it ever. Is it too late to prune it? No, I think you could take that Carolina Jasmine and cut it all the way down to where it's barely near, you know, up near the roof. I'd take the part that's across the whole top and just cut it all off and get all that dead stuff out of it. And what you'll find, one of their concerns in the question was it took years for that thing to be planted, climb up that post, and then cover that whole top. Now it's on a root system that's very, very different than when you initially planted it. So when it grows back this time, it's going to grow back with speed, and it's going to be very happy because it's going to have more sun, and it's going to have more space, and it's going to, you know, so it should grow back in much, much faster. And you can hard prune. You can hard prune it without any problem at all. If you haven't fertilized it or mulched around the base of it, you know, make sure all those things are done. It's not, you know, in competition with weeds and all those kinds of things. So thank you guys very much for following along with the channel. And again, this is Tom and Ram Gibsons Garden here in Athens, Georgia. There'll be a couple, I think I'm going to do a couple little walk around videos with the stabilizer out here and show it off, and a couple videos that you guys will see soon. Thanks for watching.